Welcome, history enthusiasts. Today, we're stepping back in time to explore a world of castles, crowns, and constant intrigue. Have you ever wondered what life was really like for a medieval princess? Forget the fairy tales of endless luxury and romance. Today, we dive into the harsh realities, hidden struggles, and surprising truths behind the gilded walls of royalty. From arranged marriages to court intrigue, restrictions, and the pressures of legacy, we'll uncover why being a medieval princess was far more challenging and dangerous than most people realize. So, let's journey together into the fascinating and often perilous world of medieval royalty. The life of a princess. When most people imagine a princess, they conjure images of glittering gowns, sparkling jewels, grand castles, and adoring crowds cheering at every turn. Fairy tales, movies, and popular culture have long perpetuated this dreamy idea that the life of a royal daughter is effortless, luxurious, and filled with happiness. But the reality of being a medieval princess was far from this enchanting fantasy. In truth, from the moment a girl was born into royalty, her life was essentially taken out of her own hands, governed instead by a combination of political strategy, family duty, societal expectation, and the unrelenting gaze of history. To understand why a medieval princess's life was more of a gilded cage than a fairy tale, we must first examine the conditions of their birth, their early upbringing, and the world they were born into. From the very beginning, the birth of a princess was treated not as a personal or family milestone, but as a political event of immense consequence. The arrival of a royal daughter could inspire joy for her family, certainly, but more importantly, she was immediately recognized as a potential political asset. In kingdoms across Europe and beyond, the birth of a girl was both celebrated and calculated. A daughter could be married off strategically to strengthen alliances, secure borders, or unite feuding noble families. While in modern times, the arrival of a child might primarily be a matter of personal happiness and family planning, in the medieval period, a princess was essentially a tool for future diplomacy. Even from her first moments of life, she was being groomed for a purpose beyond herself. Every cry, every milestone in her infancy, was less about her individual growth and more about how she would eventually serve the needs of the kingdom. Her childhood, which in theory should have been a time of innocence, learning, and play, was often regimented and highly controlled. A medieval princess was not free to explore her interests or form an independent identity. Instead, her early years were largely dictated by tutors, governesses, and the ever-watchful eyes of the royal household. These women, many of them highly skilled in etiquette, education, and courtly manners, ensured that the princess was shaped into the ideal young noblewoman. From an early age, she was taught reading, writing, and the foundational elements of diplomacy, because her ability to communicate effectively in letters, court conversations, and negotiations would one day become crucial. Music and dance were essential parts of her education, not merely for entertainment, but because they were social tools. To perform beautifully in courtly settings was to reflect grace, sophistication, and the cultural refinement of her family. Every movement, every note, every carefully learned bow or curtsy was a form of preparation for a life that would demand constant performance. Yet, this education was selective and strictly utilitarian. While she might learn to recite poetry, sing harmoniously, or play a lute, subjects that might cultivate curiosity or intellectual independence were often neglected. Critical thinking and personal choice were secondary to skills that enhanced her utility as a princess. Arithmetic might be limited to managing household expenses or dowries. Geography and history would focus on neighboring kingdoms and political rivals. Philosophy, Natural sciences, or anything that encouraged independent thought, was considered less necessary, perhaps even dangerous, as a well-educated princess might dare to challenge her role. In essence, her education was a carefully curated toolset designed to produce a competent diplomat and obedient consort, rather than a free, thinking individual. The world outside her royal walls was largely a mystery, one she would only experience through the lens of duty and political necessity. Even leisure was tightly controlled. Playtime, if it existed, was not free, form, or spontaneous. Dolls and toys might be present, but they were often chosen to mimic the social realities she would face as an adult. Dolls were frequently dressed in miniature royal attire, encouraging early familiarity with courtly dress and social hierarchy. Games and exercises were used to teach patience, discipline, and the ability to follow rules, qualities essential for surviving in a world where every action was scrutinized. In many ways, the princess's childhood was a constant rehearsal for the life of constraint and obligation that awaited her. Unlike the common children of her era, who might run freely through village fields, play games with friends, and explore their surroundings, the princess's world was confined, sanitized, and staged. The castle walls were protective, yes, but they were also boundaries limiting freedom, curiosity, and autonomy. And then there was the looming reality of marriage. Long before most of us even contemplate the idea of choosing a life partner, medieval princesses were already part of extensive marriage negotiations, often arranged while they were infants. Families would consider alliances, potential threats, and the balance of power across kingdoms when planning a princess's future. By the time she reached her early teens, she might be told, without room for discussion, whom she would marry. Love, personal preference, and emotional readiness were rarely priorities. Political necessity was everything. Imagine being a child and learning that your entire future, where you live, who you live with, and what your role in the world will be is being decided for you by forces far beyond your control. It was a reality that could be bewildering, frightening, and suffocating, yet one that many young girls were expected to accept with grace. The societal expectation that she would be a political pawn extended beyond marriage. Even her behavior in public was subject to careful scrutiny. Every smile, glance, or gesture was evaluated for appropriateness. She had to learn the art of appearing charming, graceful, and obedient, while also subtly signaling intelligence, poise, and loyalty. Her conduct reflected not just on her family, but on the kingdom itself. A misstep could be magnified, interpreted as incompetence, or even seen as a threat to the social order. In this environment, there was little room for genuine self-expression. Authenticity was a luxury she could rarely afford. Every lesson, every piece of advice, every correction from her tutors was designed to mold her into a perfect image of royalty, often at the cost of her individuality. Health and upbringing were also complicated by the realities of medieval life. Disease, poor sanitation, and limited medical knowledge posed constant threat, even to the highest-ranking individuals. A young princess might have access to the best care available at the time, but that care was primitive by modern standards. Illness could strike suddenly and be fatal, and even minor ailments were often treated with harsh remedies. Nutrition, while relatively better than the common folk, was also carefully controlled, focusing on foods that would maintain her health and appearance rather than her personal preference. Childhood illnesses, accidents, or even small injuries could have lasting consequences, underscoring the precarious nature of life, even for someone born into privilege. The psychological impact of such an upbringing cannot be overstated. Living under constant observation, knowing that her entire life was a matter of political consequence, and being taught that her worth was defined by duty rather than personal choice, could be incredibly isolating. Many medieval princesses developed a keen sense of self-discipline, tact, and resilience as a result, but these traits often came at the expense of emotional freedom. Friendships were cautious and measured. Trust was rarely absolute. Every interaction, every smile, had to be calculated. The mental burden of such a childhood was immense, and yet it was normalized as the standard for royal upbringing. Historical examples abound that illustrate the harsh realities of early royal life. Consider Princess Margaret of Anjou, who grew up in a politically turbulent England and was married to King Henry VI at a young age to cement an alliance, or Marie de Medici, who was strategically married into the French royal family to strengthen political ties. Their childhoods were dominated by tutors, political advisors, and preparation for roles they did not choose. Even centuries later, historians studying these figures note how their early lives were marked by a tension between the comforts of privilege and the constraints of duty. Their stories remind us that being born into royalty did not guarantee happiness or personal freedom. It guaranteed responsibility, visibility, and expectation. And while we often think of castles as magnificent homes, they were also instruments of confinement. Thick walls, guarded gates, and strict schedules meant that a princess's physical environment was both protective and restrictive. The castle served as a microcosm of the kingdom, where social hierarchies were rigid, movement was controlled, and observation was constant. A princess could never truly disappear or act without consequence. Even private moments were subject to scrutiny by servants, tutors, and advisors. In a sense, the castle was both a home and a cage, a gilded space where beauty, discipline, and control coexisted, but where autonomy was severely limited. Even interactions with family could be complicated. While love and affection existed, the relationships between parents and princesses were often framed by expectations and duties. A father might view his daughter as a future instrument of diplomacy. A mother might emphasize etiquette and poise over emotional connection. Siblings, too, could be rivals in the intricate dance of succession, favor, and attention. In this environment, the natural bonds of childhood were often intertwined with the pressures of status and power, making the simple pleasures of play, laughter, or personal choice rare commodities. By the time she approached her early teens, the princess had already lived a life structured around preparation for adulthood. Adulthood defined not by personal desire, but by political necessity. She had learned lessons of diplomacy, poise, obedience, and social maneuvering. She had been taught to see her own value in terms of the power and influence she could bring to her family and kingdom. She had been trained to perform, to impress, and to navigate a world of expectation with grace. And yet, despite all this preparation, the reality awaiting her was daunting: marriage, political intrigue, and a life in which her personal desires would often be subordinate to the needs of her family and kingdom. So, when we romanticize the life of a medieval princess, it is essential to recognize the gulf between fantasy and reality. Her life may have been filled with luxuries, but it was also structured around immense responsibilities, restrictions, and expectations. The dresses, jewels, and castles came with a cost, a childhood shaped by duty rather than choice, a life planned by others, and an early introduction to the harsh realities of politics and survival. In essence, the life of a medieval princess was not one of carefree luxury, but of careful, often suffocating preparation for the world she would inherit. a world in which her beauty, intelligence, and obedience were tools, and her own desires were often secondary. To be a princess was to live in a constant balancing act between privilege and confinement, between admiration and expectation, between childhood innocence and adult responsibility. When considering the life of a medieval princess, one of the most important aspects of her upbringing was her education, though it might not resemble what we imagine when we think of learning. In today's world, education is often seen as a means of personal growth, a way to cultivate curiosity, develop passions, and acquire skills for the future. For medieval princesses, however, education had a very different purpose. It was primarily designed to shape her into an ideal royal woman, to prepare her for the complex world of court life, political alliances, and the expectations that would come with her title. Every lesson, every hour spent with tutors, and every skill learned was measured against the ultimate goal of making her a valuable asset to her family and kingdom. From the very beginning, the training of a princess was a delicate balance between refinement, practicality, and performance. Tutors and governesses were selected with great care. These women were expected not only to instruct the princess in academics, but also to mold her character and behavior. They taught her to read and write with clarity and elegance, often in multiple languages, because literacy was essential for correspondence with foreign courts. Letters were not casual, they were instruments of diplomacy. A poorly written letter could reflect badly on her family or be used against them in political disputes. As a result, precision, grammar, and the art of polite expression were emphasized from a very young age. A princess had to be articulate, persuasive, and charming on paper as well as in person. Mathematics was included in her education, but again, it was practical rather than abstract. A princess might be taught arithmetic to understand dowries, manage the household finances, or oversee estates, but she would rarely study geometry, algebra, or advanced mathematics unless it served a specific political purpose. Numbers were tools, not a field for intellectual exploration. Similarly, history was taught with a focus on political awareness. She learned about her own kingdom, its rulers, its allies, and its rivals, all to ensure that she understood the complex web of power in which she would soon play a role. While this knowledge might appear useful, it also reinforced the reality that her world was largely defined by politics, and her actions, words, and decisions would always have consequences beyond herself. In addition to academic skills, the princess's training placed enormous emphasis on etiquette and social graces. Dancing, singing, playing musical instruments, and learning how to converse with nobles and foreign dignitaries were all considered essential. Each gesture, each smile, and even each pause in conversation was taught and rehearsed. A princess had to appear graceful and natural, yet every movement was carefully calculated. This was not merely for appearances. In the intricate and often dangerous world of courtly life, a misstep in etiquette could lead to scandal, alienation, or even political disadvantage. Thus, grace became a form of survival. The lessons she learned were designed to instill poise and confidence, while simultaneously reinforcing her dependence on the approval of others. The role of religion in education was also significant. A medieval princess's life was deeply intertwined with the church, and her moral instruction was often inseparable from her academic training. She was taught religious texts, prayers, and rituals, not only to cultivate piety, but also to demonstrate her moral authority and legitimacy. Her faith was considered a reflection of her family's virtue and a tool for social influence. Religious lessons reinforced obedience, humility, and patience, virtues that would be tested constantly in a life of limited freedom. Moreover, the Church was a powerful institution, and understanding its influence and expectations was crucial for a princess navigating court politics and alliances. Physical education, while less emphasized than intellectual or social training, was also part of a princess's upbringing. She learned the basics of horsemanship, hunting etiquette, and sometimes even archery, not necessarily to engage in these activities herself, but to understand and participate in the rituals and spectacles of the aristocracy. Hunting trips, for instance, were as much about demonstrating status and diplomacy as they were about skill. Being able to ride gracefully or observe the proper decorum during a hunt was another way to display competence and refinement. Similarly, games and exercises were often designed to improve posture, strength, and agility, all of which contributed to an image of physical perfection expected of women in high society. Perhaps one of the most psychologically demanding aspects of her training was the constant emphasis on restraint and self-control. Princesses were taught to conceal their emotions, to moderate their reactions, and to present a calm, composed exterior regardless of internal turmoil. Fear, sadness, frustration, or anger were not considered appropriate expressions of character for a royal daughter. This emotional discipline was reinforced in every lesson, interaction, and observation, subtly instilling a mindset where her inner life was secondary to outward performance. It is easy to underestimate how challenging this could be for a young girl, especially when she was aware that every word and gesture could be recorded, remembered, or misinterpreted by those around her. The princess's social education extended beyond formal lessons and into the broader structure of court life. She was trained to navigate relationships with servants, nobles, and family members, all of whom had their own agendas and ambitions. Understanding social hierarchy, anticipating the needs and reactions of others, and exercising influence without overt power were all crucial skills. In many ways, the castle itself functioned as a living classroom, a microcosm of the world she would inhabit as an adult. Observing interactions, recognizing subtle cues, and responding appropriately became second nature, even if it meant suppressing personal inclinations or desires. A critical component of her education was learning the art of diplomacy. While we often associate diplomacy with kings, queens, and ambassadors, princesses played vital roles in fostering alliances and maintaining peace. Letters, gifts, gestures, and marriages were all tools in this intricate political game, and a princess needed to master the nuances of these interactions. Her ability to converse, charm, and negotiate could directly impact the security and prosperity of her family and kingdom. These lessons were subtle, often embedded in etiquette training, social observation, or hypothetical scenarios crafted by tutors. Yet the stakes were high. Misjudgment or imprudence could have serious consequences. Even the seemingly small aspects of her upbringing were carefully curated to reinforce her role. Clothing was not only about beauty, but also about status, symbolism, and diplomacy. A princess was taught how to dress appropriately for various occasions, understanding that every color, jewel, and fabric choice sent a message. Gold and jewels signified wealth and power, while certain colors or patterns could indicate alliances or familial connections. Every detail mattered, and the ability to present herself properly was both an artistic skill and a political necessity. One of the most challenging aspects of this education was that it often occurred in isolation. Unlike ordinary children who might learn from peers, engage in games, or explore freely, a princess's learning environment was highly controlled. Interaction with others was selective, monitored, and frequently tied to performance. Friendships were carefully curated, and even playtime could be an extension of formal education. Dolls and toys, for example, were not merely for amusement. They were often miniature representations of social hierarchies, teaching lessons about status, decorum, and responsibility. Every activity, whether formal or informal, reinforced the larger lesson. Her life was a preparation for a role far greater than personal happiness or fulfillment. It is also important to consider the pressures imposed by the knowledge of her future. From a young age, a princess was aware that her education, demeanor, and skills were investments in her eventual marriage and political utility. This awareness created a subtle, constant stress that shaped her psychological development. While modern children might dream of their future careers or relationships, the medieval princess's path was largely predetermined. Her personal preferences, ambitions, and desires were secondary to the strategic goals of her family. Even the act of learning was framed as a duty rather than an exploration of personal potential. The role of tutors and governesses in shaping her character cannot be overstated. These women were not only instructors, but also gatekeepers, mentors, and enforcers of the rules. They were responsible for instilling virtues such as obedience, patience, and humility, while also teaching the princess to navigate the subtleties of power and influence. The relationship between a princess and her tutor could be complex. While a governess might provide guidance, support, and encouragement, she was also a constant reminder of the expectations and constraints imposed by the royal household. The princess's emotional world was carefully monitored, and deviations from the expected behavior could result in correction, admonishment, or social consequences. Historical examples illustrate the intensity and purpose of this education. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, whose early education prepared her to rule territories, negotiate marriages, and engage in diplomacy with skill and intelligence. Or Margaret of Anjou, whose upbringing in England was designed to prepare her for a politically strategic marriage to King Henry VI. These women were exceptional in part because their training emphasized not just refinement and beauty, but also intelligence, political awareness, and strategic thinking. Yet even for such remarkable figures, the demands of education and preparation were immense, shaping every aspect of their childhood and adolescence. The rigorous training of a princess also extended to her understanding of gender roles and expectations. From an early age, she was taught what it meant to be a woman of status in a patriarchal society. Her behavior, speech, and demeanor were constantly evaluated, and her worth was measured by her ability to fulfill societal expectations. She was taught to be charming, obedient, and graceful, while also demonstrating intelligence and discretion. This duality, being both submissive and strategically capable, required constant attention, self-discipline, and adaptability. It is easy to underestimate how challenging it would have been for a young girl to internalize and perform these roles simultaneously, day after day, year after year. By the time a princess reached her early teens, she had already spent years immersed in a carefully orchestrated educational and social training program. Her life had been structured around the cultivation of skills, virtues, and behaviors designed to ensure her success in the complex world of royal duty. Reading, writing, music, dance, etiquette, religion, diplomacy, and social observation were not optional, they were essential. Every lesson reinforced the message that her personal desires were subordinate to her family's strategic needs. She had learned to perform, to anticipate expectations, and to navigate the intricate dynamics of courtly life, often at the cost of personal freedom and self-expression. Even with this rigorous training, the transition from education to real life application was daunting. The skills and knowledge she had acquired were only useful if she could deploy them effectively in a world governed by politics, intrigue, and hierarchy. A single misstep, whether in conversation, appearance, or judgment, could have serious repercussions. The education of a medieval princess was therefore not merely academic or artistic. It was a constant preparation for a life in which her survival, happiness, and influence were inextricably linked to her ability to perform and navigate complex social and political landscapes. In the end, the education of a medieval princess was a delicate combination of privilege, constraint, and preparation. She enjoyed luxuries, learned refined skills, and had access to resources far beyond those of ordinary children. Yet these advantages were inseparable from the limitations imposed by her role. Every lesson, every activity, and every relationship was part of a carefully orchestrated plan to mold her into an ideal royal daughter, wife, and political instrument. The process was exhausting, isolating, and demanding, leaving little room for personal choice, curiosity, or rebellion. To be a princess was to live a life of constant preparation, a life in which education was not a path to self-fulfillment, but a tool for shaping a role she did not choose in a world she did not control. Marriage for a medieval princess was unlike anything most of us could ever imagine today. When we think about marriage in contemporary terms, we often envision romance, love, shared interests, and personal choice. Even when people marry for practical reasons, the notion of consent and personal preference plays a role. For a medieval princess, however, marriage was rarely, if ever, about love. From the moment she was born, her family viewed her as a potential instrument for political strategy. Her beauty, her lineage, and her very existence were assets, and her future husband was chosen not for compatibility or affection, but for what he could bring to the alliance of kingdoms, the expansion of influence, or the protection of borders. In short, marriage was a transaction, a political chess move, and her personal feelings were largely irrelevant. Even the earliest stages of marriage negotiations were carefully orchestrated. Long before a princess reached puberty, diplomats, kings, and advisors would discuss potential suitors, examining the political benefits of various matches. Factors such as territory, military strength, familial alliances, and even the temperament of the prospective husband were considered. In some cases, alliances were forged decades before a princess even understood the concept of marriage herself. Imagine being a child, knowing that people in distant kingdoms were debating the fate of your future as though you were a piece of land, a coin, or a rare commodity, rather than a human being with emotions, dreams, and fears. Once a suitor was chosen, negotiations over dowries, gifts, and ceremonial arrangements began. A dowry could include vast sums of money, land, livestock, or precious goods, and the negotiations surrounding it were intense and sometimes bitter. The princess herself, still a child in many cases, had little understanding of these transactions, yet she was expected to absorb lessons about decorum, negotiation, and diplomacy, all of which were crucial to presenting herself as a desirable partner. She was being trained not just to marry, but to symbolize the alliance itself, the embodiment of her family's prestige, wealth, and power. When the time came for the wedding, the pressure intensified. The ceremony itself was more than a union of two people. It was a public spectacle, an affirmation of political strategy, and a performance witnessed by hundreds, sometimes thousands, of nobles, clergy, and commoners. Every detail mattered. The princess's attire, posture, and expression were scrutinized for signs of grace, intelligence, and suitability. One misstep, a faltering curtsy, a wrong word, or an awkward glance could be interpreted as incompetence or impropriety. In a society where perception often mattered more than reality, appearances were paramount, and the weight of expectation was immense. But the pressures did not end with the ceremony. Marriage for a medieval princess came with immediate responsibilities, particularly in producing heirs. Fertility was considered a crucial duty, and the ability to bear children, especially sons, was often seen as the measure of a princess's worth. Young brides, some barely entering their teenage years, were thrust into a role that demanded both physical endurance and emotional resilience. Pregnancy in the medieval period was fraught with danger. Medical knowledge was limited, sanitation was poor, and complications during childbirth were common and often fatal. Even with the best care available, many princesses faced life-threatening situations during their first pregnancies, with repeated pregnancies further taxing their health. Childbirth was not a private or intimate matter, it was a public duty, and failure could lead to shame, alienation, or political consequences. Beyond the physical dangers, the psychological toll of marriage was immense. A princess was now living under the constant scrutiny of her husband, his family, and the court. Her actions, words, and even her expressions were analyzed for signs of loyalty, intelligence, and obedience. Her freedom was severely restricted, and personal desires were subordinate to the expectations of her new household and kingdom. Many princesses endured neglect, emotional abuse, or political marginalization if they did not conform perfectly to these expectations. In some tragic cases, a princess could be imprisoned, exiled, or even poisoned if she was deemed inconvenient, uncooperative, or threatening to her husband's interests or political agenda. History is filled with accounts of royal women whose fates were determined not by personal merit, but by the whims and strategic calculations of men in power. The social dynamics within marriage were equally challenging. A princess often entered a household filled with complex relationships and rivalries. Servants, advisors, and courtiers each had their own agendas, and she had to learn quickly how to navigate these dynamics to maintain her influence, dignity, and safety. Even relationships with siblings or extended family could become politically charged as alliances shifted and loyalties were tested. The ability to remain composed, strategic, and persuasive was essential. Every interaction could have repercussions, and the stakes were high. A single miscalculation could undermine her position or the alliance she represented. Love and personal connection, while not impossible, were exceedingly rare in these arranged unions. Many princesses formed bonds with their husbands out of necessity rather than affection. Some adapted to the role and found ways to exert influence, manage their households, and even protect their own interests. Others endured resentment, isolation, and loneliness, the emotional labor required to maintain appearances, fulfill expectations, and survive within the constraints of marriage was staggering. A princess's inner life, her hopes, fears, and desires, was often invisible, hidden beneath layers of duty, performance, and political necessity. In addition to the personal and emotional challenges, marriage brought with it enormous responsibilities. A princess was expected to manage the household, oversee estates, and sometimes even participate in governance. In some cases, she might act as a regent during her husband's absence, making decisions that affected the lives of thousands. While this could provide opportunities for influence and power, it also meant that failure or misjudgment could have dire consequences. The skills she had learned during her education, diplomacy, etiquette, and strategic thinking, were now put to the ultimate test. Every decision, from managing staff to negotiating alliances, could affect her family's reputation, wealth, and political standing. Health and longevity were constant concerns. The physical demands of pregnancy, childbirth, and managing a household were compounded by the threat of disease, poor nutrition, and limited medical knowledge. Many princesses suffered chronic health issues, complications from repeated pregnancies, or debilitating illnesses that could affect their ability to fulfill their duties. Mental health, though rarely acknowledged, was also a significant challenge. Anxiety, depression, and emotional strain were common, yet support or understanding was minimal. The expectation was to endure silently, to maintain composure, and to continue fulfilling duties regardless of personal suffering. Marriage also exposed a princess to the complexities and dangers of political intrigue. Alliances could shift unexpectedly, wars could erupt, and rival factions within the court could seek to manipulate or undermine her. She needed to be vigilant, strategic, and sometimes ruthless to survive. In some cases, a princess could be used as a scapegoat or bargaining chip in disputes, facing exile, imprisonment, or worse if she was perceived as a threat or liability. Trust was fragile, and the ability to navigate treacherous political waters required constant awareness, adaptability, and emotional intelligence. The stakes were nothing less than survival of herself, her children, and her family's legacy. Historical examples illustrate the severity of these challenges. Take Isabella of France, who married Edward Roman II of England. Her marriage was marked by political tension, personal betrayal, and manipulation by rival factions. Despite the luxuries of royalty, she faced enormous pressure to produce heirs, navigate court politics, and protect her children's future, all while managing her own survival in a hostile environment. Similarly, Margaret of Anjou, whose life has been widely chronicled, faced constant political intrigue, wars, and personal danger, demonstrating that marriage for a princess was rarely a sanctuary and often a battlefield. These examples reveal a pattern. Marriage was a tool of power and survival, not personal fulfillment, and even the most privileged women faced extraordinary pressures and dangers. Even the social perception of marriage added to the burden. A princess was expected to embody the ideals of beauty, virtue, and obedience. Public opinion, shaped by courtiers, chroniclers, and foreign observers, could elevate or undermine her reputation. Rumors, gossip, and scandal could threaten her position, and her ability to manage appearances was critical. In this environment, every smile, gesture, or word was a performance. The pressure to maintain a flawless public image while navigating private challenges created a life of constant vigilance, emotional restraint, and strategic calculation. Beyond personal survival, marriage had consequences for entire kingdoms. Alliances formed through royal unions could prevent wars, secure borders, or strengthen claims to territory. Conversely, failed alliances could spark conflict, rebellion, or political instability. A princess's actions, decisions, and even demeanor could directly influence the fate of nations. This reality underscored the immense responsibility placed on young women, who were expected to master diplomacy, strategy, and social skills while still navigating the challenges of adolescence and personal development. The weight of expectation was enormous, and failure carried consequences far beyond personal disappointment. It could alter the course of history. The physical environment of marriage added another layer of complexity. Castles and royal residences, while luxurious, were often imposing and isolating. A princess moved from the familiarity of her childhood home into an unfamiliar household, surrounded by strangers, and immediately had to assert herself within a rigid hierarchy. Her movements, interactions, and routines were closely monitored, and every action had potential political significance. Even leisure or private moments were constrained, as servants, advisors, and courtiers were constantly present or observant. The castle was at once a palace and a prison, a place of wealth and comfort, but also of limitation and constant scrutiny. The transition from childhood to marriage was therefore abrupt, intense, and unforgiving. The years of education, preparation, and social training culminated in a reality that demanded immediate competence, composure, and strategic awareness. Even exceptional intelligence, charm, and grace could be tested by circumstances beyond the princess's control. Political upheaval, illness, betrayal, or the whims of her husband and his advisors. Survival required not only skill and intelligence, but also resilience, patience, and the ability to navigate constant uncertainty. Every decision, every interaction, and every performance mattered, and the consequences of error could be severe. Marriage also reshaped a princess's identity. No longer simply a daughter, she became a wife, a potential mother, and a representative of her family and kingdom. Her personal desires, ambitions, and inclinations were secondary to her duties. In some cases, she could find ways to exert influence, manage her household effectively, and shape political outcomes. In others, she was constrained, marginalized, or threatened. The range of experiences was vast, but the common thread was that marriage transformed her life in profound, irreversible ways, often placing immense burdens on young shoulders. Even for those who survived and thrived, the personal cost was high. Relationships, emotional well-being, and personal freedom were constrained by expectation and necessity. Many princesses learned to conceal disappointment, frustration, and fear, developing a disciplined, strategic approach to daily life. They became experts in the art of survival, navigating a world where appearance, compliance, and performance were essential. The lessons learned through marriage and court life were often harsh, and the skills acquired were born from necessity rather than choice. In conclusion, marriage for a medieval princess was far from a romantic ideal. It was a complex, high-stakes venture that combined politics, survival, social performance, and duty. From the earliest negotiations to the pressures of childbirth, household management, and political intrigue, a princess's life was defined by the expectations and demands placed upon her. Love, personal choice, and emotional fulfillment were rare privileges. Political utility, obedience, and performance were the norm. The marriage of a medieval princess was an intersection of privilege and peril, comfort and constraint, status and vulnerability. It was a life in which survival, influence, and legacy were inseparable from duty, and every action carried consequences far beyond the individual. To be a medieval princess was to live in a world where marriage was both a privilege and a profound burden, a world in which beauty, intelligence, and obedience were tools, and personal freedom was often a distant dream. Life in the royal court was far from the idyllic vision of glittering halls and grand feasts that popular imagination often suggests. For a medieval princess, the court was not merely a residence or a place of ceremonial importance. It was a complex and often treacherous social ecosystem. Within its walls, every word spoken, every gesture made, and every relationship navigated could have profound consequences for her personal survival, her family's political position, and the perception of her own influence. While the castle provided security, luxury, and prestige, it was also a pressure cooker of competition, jealousy, and constant scrutiny. Understanding court life is essential to grasping why the existence of a medieval princess, even at the height of her privilege, could be as perilous as it was glamorous. From the moment a princess entered court life, she was immersed in a world governed by hierarchy, etiquette, and unspoken rules. These structures were rigid, and violations, intentional or accidental, could be severely punished socially or politically. Every interaction carried meaning. For example, the simple act of greeting a noble could indicate loyalty, disrespect, or alignment with a particular faction. A curt nod, An awkward bow, or even hesitating before speaking, could be interpreted as defiance or incompetence. This constant need for precision placed immense pressure on a young woman who, in any other context, would be able to express herself naturally and freely. The court trained her to behave not just correctly, but strategically, teaching her that survival depended on mastering the nuances of power, influence, and perception. The court was also a center of relentless observation. Servants, guards, advisors, and other courtiers were always watching, assessing her behavior, and reporting back to their superiors. Every smile, glance, and gesture could be remembered, misinterpreted, or leveraged in political schemes. Privacy was limited. Even private conversations could be overheard or manipulated. As a result, princesses learned early on to conceal emotions, moderate reactions, and carefully choose their words. Fear, frustration, and sadness were luxuries they could seldom afford to display openly. Emotional discipline was not only expected, it was essential for survival. The ability to project confidence, poise, and subtle intelligence, while simultaneously hiding vulnerability, became a lifelong skill. One of the most challenging aspects of court life was navigating the social hierarchies and rivalries that permeated every level of the castle. Courtiers, advisors, and attendants each had their own agendas, ambitions, and loyalties, which could shift unexpectedly. Some sought to curry favor with the princess in order to gain influence over her husband or family. Others might attempt to undermine her, spread rumors, or manipulate events for their own benefit. A princess had to quickly learn who to trust, when to speak, and how to assert herself without appearing threatening. Misjudging a relationship could result in social ostracism, damage to her reputation, or even political danger. The court was a chessboard, and every move mattered. This environment was particularly challenging because alliances and rivalries within the court could be fluid and unpredictable. A courtier who appeared friendly one day might become a dangerous adversary the next, depending on shifting political tides or personal grievances. Young princesses were taught to read subtle cues, changes in tone, expression, posture, or even the timing of speech, to anticipate threats or opportunities. They were trained to recognize patterns of behavior and the motivations behind them, developing a form of social intelligence that was as vital as any academic lesson learned in childhood. The ability to navigate these dynamics effectively could determine her personal safety, her influence within the court, and the success of her family's political objectives. Even seemingly trivial matters, such as attire, appearance, and demeanor, were fraught with meaning. Clothing was never simply about fashion. It was a statement of status, allegiance, and strategy. A princess's choice of color, fabric, or embellishment could signal support for a particular faction, demonstrate wealth and influence, or reflect her family's political ambitions. Jewelry and accessories carried similar significance, often symbolizing alliances, favor, or loyalty. Missteps in presentation could be interpreted as disrespect, incompetence, or disloyalty. Thus, learning to dress appropriately for every occasion was not merely a matter of taste. It was a critical component of courtly strategy. The dynamics of conversation and rhetoric were equally important. A princess had to be articulate, persuasive, and diplomatic at all times. Every statement was potentially an instrument of influence or a source of vulnerability. She was trained to speak in measured tones, with careful consideration of both content and delivery. Humor, irony, or casual speech could be dangerous if misapplied, while silence could be interpreted as either wisdom or weakness. The mastery of language, tone, and timing was therefore an essential skill for survival, and one that required constant attention and refinement. Court life was also a constant performance of morality, virtue, and obedience. A princess was expected to embody the ideals of the time: piety, chastity, humility, and loyalty. Public perception was crucial. Scandals or rumors could damage her reputation irreparably, affecting not only her personal standing, but also the political fortunes of her family. Allegations of impropriety, real or fabricated, could be used as weapons in disputes or as justification for exile, imprisonment, or loss of influence. The pressure to maintain a flawless public image while simultaneously navigating the complexities of private life created an environment of continuous stress and vigilance. Within this framework, personal relationships were especially complicated. Friendships, alliances, and mentorships within the court were often motivated by strategy rather than genuine affection. A court lady might offer support, guidance, or companionship, but she could also be plotting to enhance her own influence or undermine the princess's position. Even members of the family could be competitors, allies, or obstacles, depending on the shifting landscape of succession, favor, or inheritance. Trust was fragile, and the ability to discern motive and anticipate betrayal became a vital skill. The princess had to constantly balance openness with caution, forging connections that could serve her while protecting herself from manipulation. The stakes of court intrigue were amplified by the presence of political and dynastic tensions. Wars, disputes over succession, and conflicts between noble families could transform routine interactions into high-stakes maneuvers. A princess's words, gestures, or alliances could influence negotiations, provoke hostility, or signal loyalty. In some cases, she could become a target for kidnapping, forced marriage, or coercion as rival factions sought to leverage her position for political gain. Awareness, prudence, and strategic thinking were therefore indispensable. Survival in court life required constant vigilance, foresight, and adaptability. The psychological toll of court life on a princess was immense. Living under continuous scrutiny, facing the potential for betrayal, and navigating complex social dynamics required extraordinary resilience. Emotional suppression was essential. Displays of fear, anger, or vulnerability could be exploited. Princesses developed acute awareness, intuition, and the ability to mask their true feelings, often from a very young age. The constant performance of composure and grace was exhausting, yet failure to maintain appearances could have serious consequences, including social marginalization, loss of influence, or even threats to personal safety. Historical examples illuminate the hazards and complexities of court life. Consider Catherine de' Medici, who entered the French court at a young age and became a masterful political operator. She navigated a web of alliances, rivalries, and factional disputes, employing diplomacy, strategy, and manipulation to secure her position and protect her children. Similarly, Margaret of Anjou faced constant challenges at the English court, managing relationships, alliances, and political crises while under intense scrutiny. These women demonstrate that survival and success in the medieval court required not only intelligence and skill, but also extraordinary patience, resilience, and strategic acumen. Even leisure and ceremonial events were fraught with significance. Feasts, balls, tournaments, and public celebrations were not simply occasions for enjoyment. They were arenas for observation, assessment, and maneuvering. How a princess carried herself in public could affect her reputation, alliances, and influence. Participation in games, dances, or hunting expeditions was often as much about demonstrating skill, grace, and loyalty as it was about recreation. In these contexts, failure, embarrassment, or poor performance could have far-reaching implications, making even leisure a high-stakes activity. The interplay between visibility and vulnerability was a constant feature of court life. A princess's presence in public, whether at ceremonial events, religious observances, or daily court routines, was both an opportunity and a risk. She could assert influence, demonstrate virtue, or signal allegiance, but she could also attract scrutiny, criticism, or suspicion. This duality required careful calibration of behavior, speech, and appearance. Every interaction, no matter how small, was imbued with meaning and potential consequence. The princess had to navigate these complexities with precision, constantly balancing her personal interests with political necessity. In addition, court life demanded adaptability to rapidly changing circumstances. Alliances could shift, factions could rise or fall, and external threats, such as wars, rebellions, or foreign invasions, could alter the political landscape overnight. A princess needed to remain aware, flexible, and strategic, adjusting her behavior, alliances, and tactics to maintain security and influence. The ability to anticipate change, interpret subtle signals, and respond effectively was essential for survival. This constant need for vigilance and adaptability created an environment of perpetual stress, requiring both mental acuity and emotional endurance. Even mundane aspects of daily life were politically charged. Meals, seating arrangements, and proximity to important figures were all governed by etiquette and hierarchy, with deviations potentially interpreted as disrespect or a challenge to authority. Private meetings, correspondence, and gifts could all carry diplomatic significance. A single misstep, intentional or accidental, could trigger a chain of consequences affecting alliances, reputation, or family fortunes. In this environment, attention to detail, strategic thinking, and disciplined behavior were not optional. They were essential. The consequences of misjudgment in court could be severe. Scandals, rumors, and political attacks could rapidly erode a princess's influence or endanger her safety. Even small errors in judgment could be exploited by rivals seeking advantage. In extreme cases, failure to navigate court life successfully could result in exile, imprisonment, or forced removal from the political sphere. The pressure to maintain composure, competence, and strategic awareness was constant and unrelenting. Ultimately, life in the medieval court required a delicate balance between visibility, influence, and safety. A princess had to perform continuously, projecting competence, virtue, and intelligence while navigating complex social hierarchies and political dynamics. She had to form strategic relationships, anticipate threats, and exercise caution, all while managing her personal emotions and ambitions. The court was a place of privilege, yes, but it was also a site of constant pressure, intrigue, and danger. Survival demanded skill, discipline, and adaptability, and even the most talented and resourceful princesses faced immense challenges. In conclusion, the medieval court was a crucible in which princesses were forged, tested, and shaped. It was a world of luxury intertwined with constraint, visibility intertwined with vulnerability, and opportunity intertwined with danger. Every action, word, and gesture carried weight. Every relationship had potential consequences. Every misstep could threaten reputation, influence, or safety. For a medieval princess, life at court was a continuous performance, requiring intelligence, strategy, discipline, and resilience. While modern imagination might picture the court as a setting of splendor and privilege, the lived reality was far more complex, demanding, and perilous. To survive and thrive, a princess needed not only grace and education, but also shrewdness, emotional control, and an acute understanding of the subtle, often dangerous, rules of courtly life. In this gilded yet treacherous environment, the line between success and disaster was thin, and every decision mattered profoundly, shaping not just her personal fate, but the destiny of her family and kingdom. For a medieval princess, the reality of her existence extended far beyond the outward glamour of castles, gowns, and ceremonial feasts. While she lived in an environment of apparent privilege, her life was also defined by limitations, confinements, and social restrictions that few could fully comprehend today. The castles and palaces that appear in fairy tales as grandiose symbols of freedom and luxury were, in truth, gilded cages. Within these walls, every movement was monitored, every interaction regulated, and every decision framed by duty rather than personal desire. To understand the daily life of a medieval princess, it is essential to grasp the profound impact of these restrictions and the psychological and emotional challenges they imposed on young women born into royalty. Physical confinement was one of the most immediate realities of her life. From early childhood, a princess was surrounded by walls that offered protection, but also imposed limits on freedom. Unlike common children who could roam fields, forests, and villages, the princess's world was largely contained within the castle or palace. She could not wander freely. Her movements were monitored by attendants, guards, and tutors. Outdoor activities, social interactions, and even play were structured, supervised, and purposeful. While her peers might explore, discover, and test boundaries, the princess was expected to remain within prescribed spaces, performing her duties and adhering to rules. This restriction of movement was not merely physical. It symbolized the larger limitations imposed on her autonomy and personal choice throughout life. The routines of courtly life further emphasized restriction. Every hour of a princess's day was often scheduled, from waking to meals to lessons and ceremonies. Her activities were carefully planned to maximize productivity, maintain appearances, and prepare her for the roles she was expected to fulfill. Free time was rare, and even leisure activities were usually educational, designed to cultivate skills in music, etiquette, or diplomacy. Spontaneity, exploration, and unstructured play, the hallmarks of childhood, were limited, and she quickly learned that deviation from expectations could have social or political consequences. In this environment, even personal relaxation or enjoyment was framed as a duty or preparation, reinforcing the constant sense of obligation and surveillance. Social restrictions were equally pervasive. A princess's interactions were highly regulated, not only by family members, but also by the hierarchy of court life. She could not choose her companions freely, and friendships were often strategic or carefully supervised. Relationships were constantly evaluated for political significance or potential risk, making genuine trust rare. Even interactions with siblings or extended family were influenced by the dynamics of succession, favoritism, and alliances. Every conversation, glance, and gesture could be scrutinized for meaning. A misstep, a word spoken too candidly, a glance interpreted incorrectly, could damage her reputation or create tensions within the household. In a world where perception often mattered more than reality, the princess learned early to moderate every aspect of her social behavior. Education and training, while invaluable in terms of skills and preparation, also contributed to isolation. Tutors, governesses, and advisors monitored her learning, often in a way that reinforced hierarchy and control rather than freedom. She might learn languages, music, dance, and political history, but the process emphasized performance over personal curiosity. Learning was a tool of preparation, not exploration. The princess was trained to master social skills, diplomacy, and etiquette, yet these lessons often reinforced the sense that her personal desires, interests, and identity were secondary to duty. While she was intellectually engaged, she was simultaneously isolated from the ordinary experiences of childhood that foster independence, creativity, and emotional growth. Isolation extended to emotional life as well. Living under constant observation and surveillance, a princess had limited opportunities to express her true feelings or develop authentic relationships. Fear, frustration, sadness, or anger could be dangerous if perceived as weakness or disobedience. The ability to conceal emotions and project composure became essential for survival. While this cultivated resilience, it also imposed psychological burdens, as young women were required to navigate complex social dynamics while suppressing natural responses. Emotional isolation compounded the challenges of social and physical restriction, creating a sense of being perpetually watched, evaluated, and constrained. Marriage, while discussed in Part 3, also contributed to this isolation. Once betrothed or married, a princess's life became even more constrained. She was expected to focus on household management, diplomacy, and reproduction, often with little opportunity to explore personal interests or develop friendships. The physical separation from her childhood home could exacerbate feelings of loneliness and disconnection. She was thrust into a new household, surrounded by strangers, with limited freedom to move or interact outside prescribed roles. Even relationships with her husband, while potentially supportive or strategic, were often constrained by expectations, hierarchy, and political considerations. Love, companionship, and emotional fulfillment were secondary to duty and alliance, further isolating her in a life dictated by necessity rather than desire. The psychological impact of such confinement cannot be overstated. Living under constant observation, performing socially prescribed roles, and suppressing personal desires created immense stress. Anxiety, depression, and emotional strain were common, though rarely recognized or addressed. Many princesses developed strategies to cope, subtle forms of rebellion, private rituals, or the cultivation of intellectual pursuits in secret. Some found solace in music, reading, or writing. Others sought companionship with carefully chosen confidants or trusted servants. Yet even these outlets were limited and often fraught with risk. Any behavior that deviated from expectation could be reported, criticized, or used against her, reinforcing the pervasive sense of vulnerability. Physical health was also impacted by these restrictions. Limited freedom of movement and rigid routines could result in a lack of physical exercise beyond controlled activities like dance, riding, or hunting etiquette. Nutrition, while often better than that of commoners, was carefully regulated for appearance and health rather than enjoyment. Combined with the physical demands of pregnancy and childbirth, these restrictions could weaken the body over time. A princess's well-being was inseparable from her ability to fulfill her social and political duties, yet her ability to care for herself independently was limited. The constant monitoring of her appearance and behavior extended even to matters of health, further emphasizing the control exerted over her life. Religious and moral expectations compounded the sense of restriction and isolation. Piety, obedience, chastity, and humility were not merely virtues. They were obligations that shaped every aspect of her life. These moral codes were reinforced by tutors, governesses, and clergy, who ensured that the princess conformed to social and religious ideals. Deviations were not tolerated lightly, and the fear of moral censure could create a pervasive sense of constraint. Even private behavior was subject to scrutiny, as adherence to these ideals was seen as a reflection not only of the princess herself, but also of her family and kingdom. The internalization of these moral codes added layers of self-discipline and self-surveillance, reinforcing the psychological weight of confinement. Restrictions on personal choice extended to almost every aspect of daily life. Decisions about clothing, activities, education, and social interactions were often predetermined or heavily guided by others. The princess's autonomy was limited, and independence was not easily exercised. Even minor decisions carried political or social significance, creating an environment in which every action required careful consideration. The cumulative effect of these restrictions was a life in which freedom, physical, emotional, and intellectual, was constrained by layers of expectation, duty, and surveillance. Isolation could be further exacerbated by the rarity of peers who shared similar experiences. While noble children existed in the court, very few could truly understand the pressures, expectations, and surveillance faced by a princess. Friends outside the royal circle were often unavailable, and relationships within the court could be strategic rather than genuine. This social separation intensified the sense of loneliness and reinforced the perception of a life lived under constant constraint. Even in the presence of attendants, tutors, or family members, the princess could feel profoundly isolated, aware that her every action was observed and judged. Despite these limitations, many princesses found ways to exert influence, develop skills, and exercise agency within the constraints imposed upon them. Some cultivated intellectual or artistic pursuits in secret, while others navigated court politics with cunning and strategy. Strategic relationships with allies, trusted attendants, or family members allowed some measure of independence or leverage. Yet even these avenues required careful calculation and vigilance. The ability to find autonomy within constraint was a testament to resilience, intelligence, and adaptability, qualities essential for survival in the demanding environment of medieval royalty. Historical examples highlight the impact of isolation and restriction. Blanche of Castile, who became Queen of France, experienced intense restrictions during her youth and early reign, yet learned to exercise remarkable political acumen and resilience within these constraints. Similarly, Margaret of Anjou navigated isolation, political danger, and courtly intrigue with strategic skill, protecting her children and influence despite enormous challenges. These examples underscore that while restrictions and isolation imposed severe burdens, they also forged qualities of discipline, intelligence, and fortitude that defined the survival and legacy of medieval princesses. Even seemingly small freedoms carried significant meaning. A rare moment of privacy, a private walk in the gardens, or a solitary visit to a chapel could offer psychological respite and a sense of autonomy. These moments, however, were fleeting and often regulated. The princess learned to value them, to seek them subtly, and to use them to sustain her emotional well-being. They became acts of quiet resistance and self-preservation within a life dominated by external control and expectation. The cumulative effect of these restrictions and isolation shaped the personality, behavior, and world-view of the princess. She developed patience, strategic thinking, discretion, and emotional resilience. She became attuned to subtle cues, able to navigate complex social and political landscapes, and adept at managing both her public persona and private life. Yet these qualities often came at a cost: suppressed emotions, limited personal freedom, and an ongoing tension between duty and desire. The life of a medieval princess was a constant negotiation between privilege and constraint, visibility and vulnerability, obligation and personal need. In conclusion, the restrictions and isolation experienced by a medieval princess were profound and pervasive. Physical confinement, regulated routines, limited social interactions, moral obligations, and surveillance created a life of constant limitation. Emotional and psychological burdens compounded these constraints, reinforcing the necessity of distance.